Okay, so thank you, everyone. We are here to discuss state implementation plan requirements for moderate non-attainment of the Environmental Protection Agency's 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard for Clark County. I'm Jody Bechtel. I'm the Deputy Director of Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability. And our department serves as the air pollution control agency for Clark County. And in that capacity is we're acting in that capacity this morning and what we're talking to you about. So on the presentation, I have Araceli Pruitt. She is our senior planner in our integrated planning section. And she is the point person on this ozone attainment effort. Lynn Hutchinson is our outside consultant. She is General Counsel and Senior Project Manager for RTP Environmental Associates. Not presenting today, Zhang Li is our Senior Air Quality Modeler, and he is also lead on our modeling effort for this action. So this is the first stakeholder meeting on this new non-attainment designation. There will be additional meetings as we will discuss further in this presentation. This is an informational meeting and it's highly technical. And unfortunately, we will be talking at you mostly. We may have some time to answer questions at the end, not looking as likely because we got a late start. If we don't have time, we will do our best to get answers to you in an email or perhaps a summary posted to our website. You are muted and will not be able to verbally ask questions, but you can post questions in the chat. And then at future stakeholder meetings, there will be opportunities for discussion. So don't get discouraged there. We will have opportunities to actually talk with you all about these actions. So this meeting is being recorded and it will be available on our website. So if you have to leave early because of the late start, or if you have staff or other stakeholders you know of that may be interested but weren't able to participate, they should be able to access this recording and watch this presentation. So there are available on that public input kind of landing page that you register through. There should be PDF of the slides that we're presenting and an acronym list. Again, it gives a lot of technical information, a lot of acronyms being thrown at you. You're welcome to reference those resources for assistance if you need it. There's also contact information for Araceli on the last slide. If you have urgent questions before any future stakeholder meetings, you can always reach out to her or Zhang Li with questions. So the agenda, we're going to go over a little bit of the situation with ozone in Clark County, attainment plan requirements, the control strategies that we're considering and control options, and then some next steps and closing comments. With that, I will turn it over to Araceli to get into the background on ozone.
Thank you, Jody. Good morning, everyone. I'm Araceli Pruitt, and as Jody said, I'm the technical lead for this project. We're going to go over some of the background. The email you received from us referred to upcoming changes to the regulatory requirements for the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards, also known as the NAAQS. Before we get into specifics about those requirements, I want to provide some general background on the ozone NAAQS. The Clean Air Act requires EPA to review each NAAQS every 5 years and revise the level of the standard if appropriate. There are NAAQS standards for 6 pollutants, ozone being one of them. In October 2015, EPA conducted its mandatory review of the ozone NAAQS and lowered the level of the primary and secondary state 8-hour standards from 70 parts per million, otherwise known as ppm, to 70 ppm. EPA determines compliance with the ozone NAAQS based on an area design value. The ozone design value is calculated through using monitored air quality data, ozone concentrations, and it is calculated by taking the 4th highest ozone concentration recorded at each monitor during the ozone season and averaging it over a 3-year period. The monitor with the highest value over the 3-year period becomes the design value site and the design value for the area. Now we're going to talk about ozone measurements. So what affects monitoring concentrations? There are a lot of things that affect it. We operate 14 ozone monitoring stations in Clark County. 9 of those are located in hydrographic area, also known as HA 212, and some of you might be familiar, it's considered the Las Vegas Valley. Ozone concentrations can be affected by local man-made pollution, cars, major sources, and natural pollution, trees emitting VOCs, volatile organic compounds, or international and national pollutant transport, and exceptional events. Exceptional events are unusual events that cannot be reasonably controlled or prevented. For example, wildfires, high wind dust, prescribed fires, stratospheric intrusions, and volcanic activity. This map shows the location of all ozone monitors in the county. You'll notice the majority are in the urban area, which is the Las Vegas Valley, also known as HA 212. I'm going to talk a little bit about our ozone designation and classification. After EPA revises the NAAQS, it goes through a process of looking at monitoring data and design values to determine what areas of the country should be designated non-attainment. The Clean Air Act also requires areas not meeting the NAAQS to be classified relative to the NAAQS. There are 5 classifications in order of severity: marginal, moderate, serious, severe, and extreme. On June 4, 2018, EPA designated hydrographic area 212 in Clark County as non-attainment for the 2015 ozone NAAQS and assigned a designation status of marginal. This map shows the boundary for HA 212 in relation to the rest of the county. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about our attainment status. So under the marginal classification, we were required to reach attainment of the NAAQS by August 3rd, 2021. This means we had to show that our design value for the 2018 through 2020 ozone season was equal to or less than 70 ppm. Unfortunately, a straight interpretation of the data didn't meet this standard, but we believe that some data could be excluded based on exceptional events. In 2021, we submitted documentation requesting exclusion of specific monitoring data from the calculation in our design value based on exceptional events due to wildfire and stratospheric intrusions. However, on June 22nd, 2022, EPA proposed not to approve these demonstrations and to find that we failed to meet our attainment based on the 2018-2020 design value, based on a 2018-2020 design value of 74 ppm. As a result of EPA's finding, hydrographic area 212 was reclassified as a moderate non-attainment area. This graph shows the ozone design value trends in hydrographic area 212 for the past 20 plus years relative to this 2015 ozone standard of 70 ppm, expressed in parts per billion here on this graph. As shown, ozone has mostly trended downward since early 2000. Later in this presentation, we'll provide a breakdown on some of the sources of our ozone precursor emissions. Keep in mind the intent of the Clean Air Act is to continually improve air quality and protect public health and the environment. As we described earlier, EPA periodically reviews each NAAQS and may lower them to accomplish this goal. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn with RTP. She is the contractor, the consultant who is helping us with this project. And she's going to talk about some of the requirements we need to fulfill to meet EPA's expectations for moderate area non-attainment plans.
Thank you, Araceli. So the reclassification to the moderate classification is going to trigger a bunch of state implementation plan requirements. And the bump up to moderate classification doesn't give the area a whole lot of time to achieve attainment. this area is now under a requirement to achieve attainment by August 3rd of 2024, which is just around the corner. DAQ has to submit a SIP revision or state implementation plan revision that includes a variety of control measures. I'm going to list them here, and then in subsequent slides, I'll go into these requirements in more detail. The first is reasonably available control technology requirements, or RACT. This is to be confused with RACM, which is reasonably available control measures. The two are separate requirements that the county will have to meet. There's also a requirement to meet a 15% rate of progress, and we'll talk about what that means. There is requirements for inspection and maintenance programs in the SIP submission, and also requirements to have emission reduction programs as contingency measures in case the area does not meet the August 3rd, 2024 attainment deadline. Under EPA's final bump up rule, EPA requires DAQ to submit a request to revise the SIP with these control measures, and also a modeling demonstration that shows the area will achieve attainment by that August 3rd, 2024 deadline. This SIP demonstration was due to EPA January 1st of 2023. And that's not a typo, guys. The DAQ has already missed this date and is at risk that EPA could start what's called an 18-month sanction clock. And if that sanction clock triggers, the area could lose federal highway funds, and EPA could come in and design its own regulatory program in what's called a federal implementation plan. So we just wanted to give you a feel for the kind of timeline pressures that the county is under to meet the SIP submission requirements. This slide shows the baseline emissions and current projections of emissions for 2017 and 2023. So 2017 is going to be used as the emissions baseline in the SIP demonstration. This is required by EPA's rules. And then 2023 will be used as the projection year because, as Araceli had explained, whether or not you achieve attainment is based on the previous 3 years of ozone data. So for the purposes of demonstrating attainment by that August 3rd, 2024 date, the data from 2021, 2022, and 2023 will be used. So 2023 will be the projection year in the SIP demonstration. Right now, DAQ is projecting that emissions for both NOx and VOC are going to go down regardless of doing anything else in the SIP requirements, but it won't get us to attainment or get you to attainment. So there will be additional emission reduction requirements. So the first of those control measures that I had on that list was reasonably available control technology. EPA has not defined this term by rule, but has issued guidance on what it means. It's described as the lowest emissions an industrial source is allowed to emit through the use of a control technology that is both economical and technically feasible. EPA's rules, under EPA's rules, there's two different kinds of RACT requirements. One is called the Control Technology Guideline, or CTG RACT requirements, and the other are RACT requirements for major stationary sources. So for the CTG RACT requirement, EPA has issued 46 control technology guidelines that set a presumptive level of emission reduction by different source category. Each CTG establishes recommended applicability thresholds and control requirements for a source category. And DAQ has to now search its entire inventory of stationary sources to determine which CTG source category it has a source operating within HA 212. If there's a source operating in 212, then DAQ is required to promulgate a CTG rack requirement for the source category. If there's not one operating, then the requirements, there are no requirements on DAQ to do a rule. These CTG rack requirements apply to non-major stationary sources. So it can go down as low as sources emitting, for example, 5 tons per year. So non-major stationary sources have to do the CTG rack requirement. Major source requirements come on for sources under the major source rack requirement, but the CTGs can serve as kind of the baseline for what needs to be done for major stationary sources. So DAQ has completed a preliminary evaluation of the stationary sources that operate in HA 212 and determined that at least 6 rack rules are going to be necessary to satisfy rack requirements. They include for metal and plastic part surface coating, degreasing operations, industrial cleaning solvents, graphic arts, which is kind of your printers and publishers out there, cutback asphalt users, and gasoline service stations for what is known as stage 1 vapor recovery control. Note that as we talk about the 15% ROP requirement in the future, you're going to see some of these source categories repeated. And we'll discuss that interface between RACT and ROP a little bit later. So the next 3 slides are just kind of included for your benefit. As we went through and characterized stationary sources, we found where rules are potentially needed. We also found a host of source categories where we believe that existing permits or existing rules likely already satisfy RACT requirements. And then a list of source categories for which DAQ has not yet identified a stationary source that operates in HA 212. So to meet the CTG VOC RACT requirements, and the CTG RACT only applies to VOC emissions, which is different than major source RACT. So the CTG VOC RACT requirement, DAQ is evaluating other state rules that have already adopted CTG RACT requirements for a source category to use those as a model in developing its own rules. Initially, DAQ is trying to find rules that are identical to the EPA's presumptive RACT level of control. But beyond presumptive RACT levels may be necessary for a source category to meet ROP requirements, again, that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Also, treatment of startup, shutdown, and malfunction emissions is an evolving area of EPA policy and guidance, and DAQ may need to address startup, shutdown, and malfunction emissions in the CTG RACT rules it promulgates, even though they are not addressed in EPA's CTGs. DAQ can deviate from that presumptive norm that EPA has established when it's appropriate. And it's interested in hearing from stakeholders on aspects of EPA's presumptive RACT measures where there might be better alternatives out there. And we'll get that kind of feedback going as we set up individual stakeholder meetings by source category. So let's move on to the major source RACT requirement. This requirement applies to major sources that have a potential to emit 100 tons per year of either VOC or NOx emissions on a pollutant-specific basis. Once RACT is triggered for a major source, the entire major source could be subject to additional emission control requirements to meet RACT. Using the Title V permits and the 2017 National Emissions Inventory, DAQ has identified 7 NOx major sources operating in HA 212 and 2 VOC major sources that will be subject to the major source RACT requirements. Importantly, EPA set a January 1st, 2023 implementation deadline for the major source RACT requirements and the CTG RACT requirements for that matter. So that date has already passed, and DAQ needs to move forward with getting rules approved and on the books as quickly as possible so that emission reductions can help towards achieving attainment. I'm going to skip this slide because of time constraints. This is basically just talking about the format that a RACT requirement has to take. So what is DAQ doing to establish the major source RACT requirements? There were 2 kind of approaches that DAQ could take. One was to do a rulemaking and regulate the entirety of a source category. And the other is to look at individual stationary sources on a case-by-case basis. Because there were only 7, 8 major sources in the HA 212 area, DAQ reached out to those major sources already and asked those sources to submit a preliminary RACT analysis that they basically, what would they think RACT would be? Those analyses have been submitted, and DAQ is in the process of reviewing those source provided information, supplementing the information as appropriate, and moving to make a final determination on what the major source RACT requirements will be. So in the end, the RACT submission that DAQ gives to EPA can take various different forms. If there's already a rule out there that meets the RACT requirements, then DAQ can just certify that rule as adequate for meeting RACT. DAQ can also promulgate a brand new rule to meet RACT requirements. Or finally, if there's a permit out there that has the RACT level of control in it, DAQ can take that permit, redact unrelated portions, and submit that permit to EPA for approval into the SIP. And once we have a better idea of what RACT is actually going to be for the major sources and all the CTG requirements, DAQ will work with the individual affected sources to figure out the best way to move forward. We think for the CTGs, in most cases, that's going to be doing the rule for those 6 rules, but there are a few categories out there that there may only be one source, and they're already permitted under the state's RACT requirements in a permit. Moving on to the next control measure, we have the reasonably available control measures. This was a general term used to describe basically enforceable provisions to generate emission reductions. EPA is not defined RACTM, but describes it in guidance as a requirement to adopt measures to bring an area into attainment as expeditiously as practicable. In addition, RACTM is used to meet the RFP, or reasonable further progress requirement, that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. EPA defines expeditiously as practicable as all of those emission reduction measures that are necessary to advance the attainment date by a year. Since we are already in a time crunch, Clark County is not envisioning that there are additional RACTM measures that will help advance the attainment date. So another requirement is the vehicle inspection and maintenance requirements. Moderate area ozone non-attainment areas have to adopt a basic, what's called I&M program for short. Clark County developed and implements a more advanced I&M program for the carbon monoxide NAAQS. And EPA has already approved this, what's called low enhanced I&M program into the SIP. For the purposes of the 2015 ozone standard, DAQ is conducting modeling to show that the low enhanced I&M program is operating at or above the basic I&M requirement for the 2015 ozone NAAQS. If EPA agrees with DAQ's demonstration, then no further regulation is needed to meet I&M requirements for the 2015 NAAQS. So throughout this presentation, I've referred to this term rate of progress, the 15% rate of progress requirement. Under the Clean Air Act, non-attainment areas must show that they achieve a 15% emission reduction over baseline. So if you remember that slide where I showed you the 2017 and 2023 levels, those are the figures that the 2017 figures are what DAQ is going to have to demonstrate that they achieve a 15% reduction. And this reduction requirement is independent of meeting attainment. So it needs to be achieved even if those reductions get you beyond attainment. Clark County was designated non-attainment for the 1997 ozone NAAQS, but it didn't have to meet a 15% ROP requirement for that NAAQS because the area was only designated as a marginal area. Now that the area is up to moderate, this 15% requirement kicks in for the first time. Reasonable further progress means the emission reductions that will achieve a 3% per year emission reduction of either VOC or NOx. Assuming HA 212 can reach attainment by its August 3rd, 2024 attainment date, no additional RFP demonstration should be necessary. But when the modeling is done and complete, we'll have a better picture of what could possibly be needed for RFP. Finally, that brings us to contingency measures. Contingency measures are things that are adopted into the SIP that if the area fails to reach attainment by its attainment date would begin to apply to an area. So if HA 212 does not reach attainment by August 3rd, 2024, DAQ will have to implement additional contingency measures, emission reduction requirements. EPA's 2015 NAAQS implementation rule did not contain specific requirements on what needs to be in a SIP to meet contingency measure requirements. EPA is in the process of developing guidance that has not yet issued. So we're just going to tell you what was required for the 2008 NAAQS standard, and that may not be the same or may be different for the 2015 standard. For the 2008 NAAQS, EPA said that control measures for contingencies must not otherwise be required by the Clean Air Act, and they need to be able to achieve a year's worth of reasonable further progress, or that 3% that I talked about earlier. It can be based on either VOC or NOx emission reductions, and it does allow use of federal control measures that have not already been credited in the attainment plan demonstration. So for example, EPA has proposed what's called good neighbor provisions, where it's going to be requiring additional emission reductions from electric generating units. If Clark County does not take credit for those reductions in its attainment demonstration that it submits, then those reductions might be credible towards a contingency measure requirement. DES is evaluating a number of different measures that might be available for contingency It's not reached any decisions yet on what might be put into the SIP for contingency measures. And those are the kinds of things that DAQ wants to talk to you about further in the additional stakeholder meetings. So potential measures that could be used to satisfy RACM, ROP, or contingency measures. Here's a list of things that DAQ is currently considering. So the first two of these are the consumer products and the agricultural and industrial maintenance surface coating requirements. The OTC, or Ozone Transport Commission, put together model rules that are more stringent than anything EPA has promulgated for these source categories. The OTC is an area of the country in the Northeast sector that the Clean Air Act specifically required all the area to be treated as non-attainment, even if design values were not showing non-attainment. And the Ozone Transport Commission was formed to help those Northeast areas reach attainment. And so that commission put together these model rules that DAQ is looking at as potential RACM, ROP, or contingency measures. The additional things that are being considered is two-stroke lawn and garden exchange program, a reformulated gasoline, looking to California's advanced or enhanced vapor recovery program, and regulations for graphic arts and degreasing. Now, the graphic arts and degreasing were categories that we saw show up on the CTG RACT list. If these additional emission reductions are necessary to meet ROP, then there would just be one rule that would satisfy both the CTG and the ROP requirements. If additional measures are adopted as contingency measures, then you could see two rules for these source categories, one for the CTG RACT and one to trigger additional emission reductions under the contingency measures. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Araceli.
Thank you, Lynn. So I'll talk about some of the next steps. We expect RAC and ROP requirements to be all that is necessary to bring HA 212 into attainment. That is, additional RACM measures will not be needed to model attainment. However, we need attainment modeling to confirm this assumption, and that will not be completed until spring 2023. We continue to evaluate control options and will set up smaller stakeholder meetings to discuss the control options for specific source categories. Given the deadlines the EPA has placed on us, we are adopting a fast-paced schedule for moving forward with the preparation of our attainment plan submittal. We plan to adopt rules that would be effective and produce emission reductions by the end of 2023, and we hope to submit our attainment plan to EPA in the fall of 2023. An overview, here is what the timelines look like. So for the implementation timeline, this table identifies the statutory timelines we're working with. Again, EPA Region 9 is aware the SIP submission deadline is unrealistic, and we are working closely with them to show good faith progress to develop the plan and adopt related regulations as expeditiously as possible in 2023. And now we'll discuss our rulemaking timeline. This table identifies the timelines we're targeting for the rulemaking process. These dates are tentative and subject to change. That kind of completes our presentation. I just wanted to say in closing that to ensure inclusive public involvement in the development of our attainment plan, we will continue to engage interested parties in the stakeholder process. If you wish to receive notices on plan developments and upcoming stakeholder meetings, you can sign up for our distribution list using the public input website, if you have not already done so. It looks like we may have a few minutes left for questions. So I'm going to ask Kevin, who is our meeting moderator, if there are any questions that have come through that we might be able to address.
We don't have any questions at this time, but we have a couple more minutes, so we'll wait and see if somebody comes in with a question.
Thank you.
As folks are thinking about questions they may have, as Araceli mentioned, we intend to do additional stakeholder outreach through March, and we do intend to probably be scheduling some of those meetings in the next couple of weeks. So you will be seeing, if you've indicated when you've registered for this meeting, certain action areas that you are most interested in, you will be contacted for those meetings. And then again, we will do additional outreach to let folks make folks aware that we are when those meetings are scheduled. Again, they will be technical, they will be particular to those actions. Anyone can participate if you're interested, but again, we are looking for particular stakeholders that these actions and rules would be impacting. And if we're not having any questions through the chat, we can certainly sign off. Again, we apologize for the technical difficulties. I'm glad we still kept within the hour time frame. Kevin, any questions?
No questions. Again, I want to apologize for technical difficulties. It sounds like we had some with our audio on the phone line too, which we're looking into.
Yeah, we'll look into that. And probably our next meetings won't be through this public input. So we'll probably be using WebEx or Teams. Hopefully we won't have these same problems. And again, that will allow us to have some discussions and you will all be able to verbally ask questions. But seeing that we have no questions right now, thank you for your participation. We really appreciate it. And stay tuned for more information.